We'll get started with the Woodbury County Conservation Foundation's annual meeting program. Thanks for joining us today on this beautiful day here in Iowa. We are really pleased to offer this event and program on a virtual fashion today. My name is Dawn Snyder, and I am the Education Program Director with the Woodbury County Conservation Board and Dorothy Pico Nature Center. Before we begin with our main event, I want to share a little bit about the Woodbury County Conservation Foundation. I have you as captive audience. I'm going to take the chance to do that. The foundation was established in 1990 to serve as a partner with the Woodbury County Conservation Board in public education and natural resources conservation projects. It's recognized as a qualified nonprofit organization under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Woodbury County Conservation Foundation provides a channel through which the Conservation Board and the Dorothy Pico Nature Center can raise money and carry over funds. There are 10 members on the board of directors that served 3-year terms. We just concluded with our annual meeting and with the election of our new members and board members and officers. And Brian Haslett is the president. Christine Zelmerzant is our vice president. And I serve as the secretary treasurer. Our at-large board members include John Helms, Robert Meese, Richard Pope, Norb Ruland, Ann Shaner, Rod Tondro, and founding board member Diane Blankenship just stepped down after serving 31 years on the board. She was a founding member in 1990, and we thank her so much for her vision and dedication. So 31 years is a great ride. Thanks so much. We are pleased to announce our newly elected director is Chris Jackson. So welcome Chris to the group. I want to share that Woodbury County Conservation Foundation's mission is threefold: to facilitate the acquisition and maintenance of public areas and preserves, especially within the Loess Hills region, to promote environmental education and the awareness of natural resources conservation, and to establish and support the Dorothy Pico Nature Center. The foundation sponsors Nature Calls, an annual event at the Nature Center that features beer tasting, nature art, and a charity auction to raise funds for educational programs and exhibits. Save the date for this September 24th will be Nature Calls, the 18th year. You can certainly learn more about us and our parks and projects and programs and events. You can find us on social media. Search Dorothy Pico Nature Center and like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe on YouTube, or visit us at woodburyparks.org for more information. And the foundation relies on annual memberships for their operational and projects budgets. Some foundation projects include habitat management of Loess Hills Prairie restoration, summer day camp scholarships, and funding the salary of naturalist interns provide programs at the Nature Center and county parks. I also want to extend a special thank you to the Loess Hills Wild Ones chapter for co-sponsoring this event. They're a nonprofit organization that promotes planting native landscapes, both small and large, in Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska. They have an annual native plant sale that was just announced, and you can learn more about that plant sale and about our Loess Hills Wild Ones at loesshills.wildones.org. All right, now a little bit about the Zoom webinar. If you hover over the bottom of the screen, you should, or it might be at the top right now, you should be able to see a Q&A box. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type those in the Q&A. And Teresa and Carrie are going to be monitoring on the back end. And if you have a question, our speaker, hopefully at the end of the talk, will be able to answer as many questions as possible. We also have activated the closed captioning feature. If that is annoying to you and you don't like to have that, you may also will see the CC button if you hover, and you can turn that off by clicking on the up arrow, or you can grab that text box and move it around different parts of your screen if you wish to not see it over top. We are also recording this webinar, so we plan to have it on our YouTube Dorothy Pico Nature Center channel in the near future. As all of you are registered for this event, you'll be getting a follow-up email with that link. Okay, finally, thank you for your patience and for joining us. I am ready for the main event. I'd like to introduce Rich Pope, Woodbury County Conservation Foundation board member, retired Iowa State Extension agronomist, and he's going to introduce our guest speaker, Deb Lewis. So go ahead and take it away, Rich.
Thanks a lot, Dawn. Appreciate that. It's my honor today to introduce Deb Lewis to be our speaker for today. Quite a talented woman who has all sorts of knowledge that would be of interest to everybody who's here today. I'd mention that Deb Lewis is in her 4th decade in Ames, living in Ames, serving the people of Iowa. She is the curator of the Ada Hayden Herbarium that is located on campus in Ames at Iowa State University. The herbarium, if you've never known or heard about it or have never been there, has approximately 2/3 of a million vouchered plants that are used by researchers and used by a lot of folks around the world, actually, to help chronicle the appearance and location of different plants, and notably in Iowa, but other places as well. As a curator, like I say, she wrangles dead plants, but it actually is more exciting than just to say that, I guess. She's gets out there in the real live world too from time to time on different forays. She and her husband Terry live just north and west of Ames, just right close to Onion Creek, if you ever have heard of that. She's an amazing botanical scholar and a great human being, in my opinion. I've known her for quite a while. She has worked with such notable botanists as Dwayne Isley, Richard Pohl, Lois Tiffany, and many others that are great systematicians. And I could go on for a while, but I'm not going to. Again, I'd recommend to you, if you have questions to ask of Deb, you can enter them in the Q&A box. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn the program over to Deb Lewis. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich and Dawn. Just a moment here. I'm going to get my screen shared here. And okay, come on. All right. So, Rich didn't mention that he and I are co-authors of at least 3 papers about Iowa's plants. And we've appreciated Rich's knowledge about Iowa weeds in particular as we worked on some projects. Oh, when was that? Back in the early 2000s, Rich? And so...
right, the first decade of the new century.
Yeah. Maybe even, I think we had a paper in the 1990s as well. When Dawn and Rich first contacted me about speaking today, I had mentioned some ideas that were a lot more targeted than this one, but I threw out this idea as maybe kind of a something for everybody kind of presentation. So we won't delve too deeply into any topic, but instead we'll cover a lot of ground. And you can, as Dawn mentioned, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer those at the end. This slide illustrates what I mean when I say I'll be speaking about a number of topics today instead of focusing on only 1 or 2. And since many of you have likely never visited a herbarium or seen specimens, we're going to start with that. I'll also share about the work of a few botanists from the University of Iowa and Iowa State. In part 2, we'll shift to a look at what we know about Iowa's flora through a few historic studies and some current and recent projects. And I will also close with suggestions of references that might be of help if you're just getting started in your interest in Iowa's plants or fungi. Before we leave this slide, I'll point out the label on the specimen of marsh marigold that's on the upper right side of the screen. And we see that this specimen was collected by Ada Hayden in May of 1907. She was an undergraduate at that time here at Iowa State. She included a lot of locality information on the label that most of the contemporaries of her time didn't bother doing when they made their own collections. Even getting her locality down to a section or square mile, while others often just wrote Ames, or worse yet, Des Moines as the locality. But let's take a look at herbarium specimens more generally. Just what is a herbarium specimen and why do we collect specimens? Well, maybe as you can see, we start with a living plant or fungus or alga or lichen. And I'm mostly going to talk today about flowering plants, but we will see some examples of fungal, algal, moss, and other specimens and see how the fungi and mosses and those groups are stored. As we look at this herbarium specimen of rough blazing star, we see that it is pressed flat, it's dried, and then mounted to a sheet of heavy paper. It also has a label identifying it and noting where it was collected in both its locality and its habitat. This specimen was collected by Tom and Diane Lammers back in 1977 from far southeast Iowa in Lee County in the Donaldson unit of Shimmick State Forest. For habitat, it was from a prairie alongside Highway 2. We also see that it was collected more than 45 years ago, yet it has held its color nicely. Now, that's not always the case, but purple colors like this blazing star tend to hold up better than many other colors. And the specimen itself also contains or includes a stamped seal and an accession number, as well as a fragment packet holding any plant parts that might have come loose during drying or over time. Both the paper and the ink used for a specimen are archival. But let's step back and walk through the process of documenting, collecting, and pressing plants. Here is a very messy page from a collecting notebook. And I can say how messy it is because it's mine. You can see that I wrote some of the information at the time of collection and then added identifications to it later. The information isn't yet precise, but in noting where I was, I could look up the additional locality information later. Since this was 1998, before cell phones or even GPS units were available for getting coordinates recorded while in the field, though there isn't much of that precise information recorded here in the field notebook. We also see that for several entries, I didn't know the plants down to species, but I could use plant keys later to determine which species I had collected. And of course, that information would wind up on the eventual label for the collected plant. Here, one of our graduate students is pressing a plant in the field. He has brought newspaper, press boards, cardboard, and straps out into the field with him. The size of the press, which is 12 by 18 inches, is just a little larger than the specimen mounting paper, which is 11.5 by 16.5. So this helps him know how he needs to bend the stem to get the specimen to eventually fit nicely on the paper and to leave room for a label. This time, Phil is pressing his plant indoors at the end of the day. I usually press my plants at the end of the day too, unless they are particularly fragile or have other issues that banging around in a plastic bag for the day or something like that might damage the specimen. But it can certainly make for a long evening if I have collected a lot during the day. And on some of my field trips up to Northeast Iowa, which I'll talk a little about later, since I don't get up there very frequently, I try to make the most of it and may come home with 50 or more specimens to need to get into the plant press. In this case, we see the slat frame of a professional press. Presses like this that are set up for collecting around a dozen or so specimens can be purchased from forestry suppliers, from Carolina Biological and other such suppliers, but they're expensive. I think they are now up to somewhere in the $125 range. Instead, I have my husband cut up scrap pieces of plywood for me. Again, 12 inches by 18 inches. And I purchased the straps from camping supply places. Cardboard separators within the press could be cut from large cardboard boxes or packing materials like around a piece of furniture or, a refrigerator or something. If you do that, though, just be sure to cut the cardboard so that the open corrugations run crosswise along the long side of the cardboard, so that you wind up with shorter corrugation length and a maximum number of openings for airflow. Also, if you're cutting your own cardboard, be sure to use a sharp cutter to avoid collapsing the corrugations. If you're really into pressing, contact me and I can let you know of sources for pre-cut cardboards that aren't too expensive. And those might be a bundle of 125 or 150, something like that. So you'd want to be kind of serious about all of this. The press is then tightened with the straps placed, the press next gets tightened with the straps and then placed in our dryer for a few days to flatten and dry the specimens. And drying can be a challenge without a heat source that allows for airflow. An oven just doesn't work. It just cooks the plants. But many non-fleshy plants will dry without heat if the press is placed over an air conditioning floor vent, for example, and the damp newspaper and cardboard gets changed daily. Once dry, the specimens will be frozen for a few days to kill any insects that might have hitched a ride. After freezing, my student workers will complete the work of gluing the label and plant material to the herbarium paper and reinforcing it with cloth tape or with heavy thread. This is how we store the accessioned specimens in herbarium cases. The specimens are filed according to the plant's classification to major plant group, within those groups to family, and by their scientific name. They are stored in colored folders so that at a glance, we know whether the folder contains specimens collected within or outside of Iowa. The cabinets have seals around the doors to keep out insects and moisture when the doors are closed. Mosses, fungi, lichens, and a few other groups are stored in packets or boxes, depending on their size or fragility. These boxes are sized to fit on the shelves in the cabinets. We were recently able to receive some grant funding from the State Historical Society for upgrading our larger storage boxes, including those that hold packets and the boxed specimens for specimens collected in Iowa. So on the lower left, you can see some pretty fancy looking boxes there with metal banding along the edges. We were able to purchase more than 1,000 of those to add to our collection here. And the grant also includes funding for replacing the thousands of folders in which the Iowa vascular plants, those that are mounted on flat sheets of paper, are stored. Here we see several of the rows of cabinets, along with two of the cabinets on an open row in the herbarium. And I am actually sitting in the herbarium, so you may have noticed this in the background with the labels on either side of my head for the particular rows. The mobile storage system was added in 2004 when the University of Iowa's herbarium was brought to Iowa State to be merged with ours. I'll say more about that in a moment, but the addition of the storage system allowed us to take in those added specimens and still leave some room for future growth. The specimen images here show 2 packets of fungi and their contents emptied out of those packets. Both of them are type specimens. They are the original specimens on which a new name is based. Types are sort of like a yardstick in the US Bureau of Weights and Standards. It's not that every yardstick sold is held up to the standard one, but conceptually, every yardstick sold at Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever should be as close as possible to the one in the Bureau of Weights and Standards. So type specimens are those earliest original specimens, and subsequent collections of that species are compared to those specimens. Getting back to the slide, the specimen on the left was originally accessioned in the University of Iowa Herbarium, while the one on the right has been at Iowa State since it was collected nearly 65 years ago. When Diana Horton was hired to join the faculty and be the director of the University of Iowa Herbarium in 1983, she brought thousands of her own specimens of mosses in her personal collection with her. Since there was no longer a mycologist, that's a person who studies fungi, at the University of Iowa, their fungal collections were transferred to Iowa State. Now, in part, that's why I was hired as the first full-time curator of the Ada Hayden Herbarium. A large part of my time during my first few years was spent in working on getting those fungal specimens added to the Ada Hayden Herbarium, and both sets of specimens, those originally at the University of Iowa and those that we held here, getting those upgraded. Unfortunately, in the early 2000s, the administrators, including the department chair and dean at the University of Iowa, decided that the herbarium should no longer be maintained there. It's a long story that partly revolves around the fact that the herbarium was still located in the former chemistry botany building on campus, while the rest of botany had moved to a different biological sciences building that unfortunately didn't have room to accommodate the herbarium. Thus, in 2004, the 230,000 specimens remaining in the University of Iowa Herbarium were moved to Iowa State. With the combined collections and subsequent growth, the Ada Hayden Herbarium, as Rich mentioned, now contains around 660,000 specimens. And this ranks us around 12th in size among university collections in the United States and 26th among all of the US herbaria, including those like the US National Herbarium at the Smithsonian and at the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis, both of which have several million specimens. But the numbers kind of quickly drop off. So it pretty quickly drops down to like our being 26th. On the left, in the example from the University of Iowa, I included a photograph of the oldest specimen that I have ever found in the merged herbaria. It was sent to the University of Iowa from the British Museum, which is now called the Natural History Museum of London. The specimen is dated at 1785. Both of these specimens also remind me to mention that herbaria are part of a network. We send and receive specimens on loan and on exchange of duplicate specimens. We also receive and send duplicate unidentified specimens as gifts for determination, meaning that in return for the expert identifying our specimen, the specimen can be added to the herbarium there where the expert is working. And we also receive, of course, a lot of specimens for expert determination here. The current director of the herbarium studies bamboos, and you can guess that she has sent quite a few specimens for the groups within the bamboos of her expertise for identification, and we get to add those specimens also to our herbarium here. Before leaving the topic of the University of Iowa's transfer, I'll just briefly introduce two of the botanists from there. The first is Bohumil Shimmick. He may have been the most traveled botanist across Iowa during his time as a professor and curator of the herbarium. He crisscrossed Iowa, collecting in probably at least one specimen from about every county in the state. He collected tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 specimens, some for the University of Iowa Herbarium and some to be sent on exchange to other herbaria, like we talked about, in expectation of increasing the diversity within the University of Iowa's herbarium in return. Like Ada Hayden, who we will hear more about shortly, he was a proponent of protecting Iowa's prairies. And there's a lot more that could be said about him, that you might recognize his name from Shimmick State Forest down in southeast Iowa. The second professor from the University of Iowa is Robert Thorne. Dr. Thorne and his students authored numerous papers on Iowa's flora and documented their findings with specimens. And some of these were studies of the floras of a county, and others were the studies of entire regions. He was a professor at the University of Iowa from 1949 to 1962, and during that time, he and his students added thousands of specimens to the herbarium that document those studies that were done in those various regions of the state. I'm often asked to give entire presentations about Ada Hayden, but today I'll share just a few highlights. First, after getting her bachelor's and master's degrees with Lewis Pamel as her advisor, she became the first woman to get a PhD at Iowa State. That's kind of surprising that she was the first in any field of study. She loved prairies, and her doctoral dissertation and many of her subsequent publications were about prairie plants and their ecology. She became an assistant professor after getting her PhD, and she held that title until her death in 1950. Fortunately, faculty promotion guidelines at Iowa State have changed since her time. She was the curator of the herbarium from 1932 until her death, and she collected around 14,000 herbarium specimens. As with Shimmick, many of those were collected in duplicate for exchange with other herbaria. She was heartbroken as she saw more and more prairies being lost to the plow for row crops, including the one that was her playground when she was a child after her family property then had to be sold. In the 1940s, she got a $100 grant to study prairies around the state. And at the end of the survey, she proposed 22 that should be purchased by the state to become state preserves. Now, we can't even imagine, I mean, that's only like 3 fill-ups of our car gas tank today, but that $100 allowed her to travel to every part of the state on multiple field trips. And she was partly successful in promoting those 22 sites be protected. And 3 of those were purchased before her death. However, in going through the list of the prairies that she tried to save and their locations, more than half of those on the list of 22 never were protected, and many of them have subsequently been plowed up. The Lime Springs Prairie in Howard County, which was one of those original 3 that were purchased, was renamed as Ada Hayden State Preserve shortly after her death. She had many talents and a few quirks, but I'll leave most stories about most of those for another presentation. However, Dr. Dwayne Isley enjoyed telling me about his adventures with Ada Hayden. And I'll quickly share one of those stories. He and Ada Hayden headed out to a prairie pasture one afternoon to collect plants. And they noted that at the far end of that pasture were a herd of cattle. And they got to work looking for plants and weren't paying that much attention. And suddenly they looked up and noticed that a bull had wandered very close to where they were working. And the bull didn't seem too happy about things. And so Dr. Isley quickly boosted Dr. Hayden up into a small tree, up onto a branch where she could sit and be above the bull should the bull decide to attack or something. And he then tore off in a sprint. He had been a track runner not too many years earlier at the University of Arkansas. And he managed to clear the fence in a single leap to get to the car. He drove around, he found a gate so that he could get into the pasture, and he pulled the car up under the tree. But still, they had to wait for a while until the bull finally wandered off. And when that had happened, he assisted Ada Hayden down out of the tree, and he asked her if she was okay. And she said that of course she was. However, while she was up in the tree, she had written a poem, and did he want to hear it? Now, I would love to see that poem, what kind of poem she would write while sitting in a tree while waiting for a bull to get out of the way. Anyway, with that story, we'll next turn to Lois Tiffany. Lois, Dr. T, as many of us knew her, overlapped with Ada Hayden while Dr. T was a graduate student. And like Ada Hayden, all of her degrees, including her PhD, are from Iowa State. And she got those degrees in the 1940s. Her interests were in fungi, and she kept that interest throughout her career. Many of her studies and the resulting specimens were of plant parasitic fungi. But she also joined with Don Huffman from Central College, her ISU colleague George Kanafis, and for the second edition of this book I'm going to mention, her grad student Roseanne Healy in the publication of Mushrooms and Other Fungi of the Mid-Continental United States. She and Dr. Kanafis and Dr. Huffman also did a 10-year morel survey, asking folks to collect morels and send them identified only to county if the collector so chose, so they wouldn't give away their morel collecting sites. But from that, they learned not only which species of morels that we have, including one that's called Morchella deliciosa, which must be a pretty good tasting morel. And those specimens are here in the herbarium documenting her study. She mentored many successful grad students who went on to become successful mycologists themselves, some in teaching, and one as a medical mycologist working alongside doctors in studying the fungal diseases of humans. Her many specimens and those of her grad students added greatly to the herbarium's holdings. Unlike Ada Hayden, she was able to progress through the faculty ranks, eventually becoming a distinguished professor, which is the highest level here at Iowa State. Both she and Ada Hayden are also inductees into the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame. So with that, we're going to transition into part 2 of the presentation, where we talk a bit about Iowa's natural and cultural history, some of the floristic studies that have been done in Iowa, and an overview of our current projects and future goals. And I will also end with a few references that might be helpful. This map gives us some hints of the diversity of soil types, changes in elevation, and other features that is a surprise to those who think that Iowa is flat, homogeneous, and uninteresting. I'll point out just a few of the landforms within this diverse matrix in a hopscotch across the state. Glaciation has worked through many millennia to shape Iowa's landscapes. So let's start our quick tour across Iowa in the west with the Loess Hills, which are wind-blown deposits of loess that were washed from the glaciers by what we now know as the Missouri River Valley. These deep loess deposits of this region, rising as much as 150 to nearly 200 feet, create a habitat for vegetation that is closer to the mixed grass prairie region that begins maybe 50 miles or so to the west than to that of the rest of the state of Iowa. So we could, in one sense, say that the west begins at the Loess Hills. The Des Moines Lobe is the southern terminus of Iowa, of the most recent Wisconsin glaciation. This landform is noted by its relatively flat terrain and rich prairie soils, dotted by prairie pothole wetlands and natural lakes. And fens, which are a special type of wetlands, are found both in the northern part of this landform and to the east on the Iowan surface, which we'll talk about in a moment when we talk about Iowa's plains. The Des Moines Lobe isn't all flat, with glacial moraines also found in this landform, especially around the edges of this landform. Prairie was predominant on this landform, and those prairies frequently burned. Thus, woodlands were mostly found in the river valleys. The Paleozoic Plateau is found in northeast Iowa. Most of this landform escaped the Wisconsin and prior glaciations as part of the so-called driftless area. It's a much more rugged, eroded area with exposed bedrock in dolomite and limestone outcrops and deep valleys. It contains areas of karst topography with sinkholes, algific talus slopes, and ice caves. These features support plant species found nowhere else in Iowa. Some of them have possibly survived here since before the time of glaciation, where these plants found refuge from the glacial advances. Bixby State Park and Preserve is a wonderful place to see an ice cave and algific talus slope with a lovely cold water stream flowing through the preserve. And a climb in the preserve to Steamboat Rock shows even more of the karst features. I'm going to combine the various plains, including the Iowan surface, the Northwest Iowa plains, and the Southern Iowa drift plain into one here. And they do have a layer of loess, but it's not nearly as deep, of course, as the Loess Hills. And these plains regions have not been glaciated as recently as the Des Moines Lobe. So there has been more time for erosion to impact these landforms. And these regions include major river valleys, rolling hills, sandstone bluffs, and other features. In the extreme northwest, in and near Gitche-Manitou State Preserve, Sioux quartzite is exposed at the surface and provides habitat for some more unusual plant species. Those that are found there are often found further north and west. We know that Iowa is largely a prairie state, sitting squarely in the heart of the tallgrass prairie biome. As mentioned earlier, it is also dissected by many river corridors. These rivers have allowed the development of savannas and woodlands, as these rivers formed a fire break for many of the prairie fires that once swept across large areas between rivers. Iowa also contains a variety of wetland habitats, including sedge meadows, fens, swamps, and marshes, as well as the prairie potholes, and of course, the larger natural lakes. Although we don't know the specifics, the land management practices of the Native Americans who lived here undoubtedly influenced what we now think of as our native flora. These practices included possibly selecting and cultivating, in quotes, native plants for food, possibly some that they brought into Iowa from distant places, and yet those plants were able to survive here. They also used fire for wildlife management by modifying habitats. These prairie fires, whether set by lightning or by Native Americans, halted the advance of the forest and kept the prairie areas treeless. Research into the effectiveness of prairie fires of the past shows that forest-derived soils occurred primarily on the eastern sides of streams, which provided breaks against the fires driven by the prevailing westerly winds. And of course, without these fires today, there has been an expansion of the woodland habitats, including savannas to more densely wooded forests. Although Julian Dubuque arrived in the area of Dubuque in 1785, Iowa began to be settled by Euro-Americans in earnest in the 1830s and 1840s. On June 1st, 1833, the first land was opened up for settlement by the United States government under the Black Hawk Purchase Treaty. Most of the Native American tribes were pushed out of the Iowa Territory by the late 1840s. Of course, we know about the Meskwaki settlement that is still in existence near Tama and Toledo. And so not all were pushed out. Then after by the late 1840s, the trickle of early Euro-American settlers became a deluge. It's said that most of Iowa was settled 1/4 section at a time. The invention of the steel plow by John Deere in 1837 came at a perfect time to aid the farmers in breaking the prairie sod. Later, clay tiles allowed the draining of the potholes and other wetlands to create yet more farmed acres. It's estimated that prairie once covered 85% of Iowa, but it didn't take long for the prairie to be transformed to cropland, as we see in comparing these two maps. The upper left map is a compilation of the historical vegetation, and prairie is shown in the tan color. And the second, on the lower right, is a modern land use map that reflects the former prairie that is now cropland, shown in gray. And we can indeed see how closely those match up. It's estimated that only 0.1% of Iowa's original prairie remains. And also there's been a great loss of native vegetation of all types in our wetlands and our woodlands. This makes Iowa the most transformed state in the country. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit after talking about those transitions of the Iowa landscape. And of course, noting the great impact that that had on the plants that were occurring here. But here on this slide, we're going to step back to note some of the contributors to Iowa's plant studies from as early as 1820 to 1950. And so the first one on the list is Edwin James. There might be some other names on here that you might also recognize. Charles Bessie is the namesake for the building here at Iowa State, where the herbarium is located. And Bessie started the herbarium when he arrived here in 1870. We also see Thomas McBride, who was a mycologist and botanist at the University of Iowa. And he started the herbarium there around 1878. And then I've already mentioned Bohumil Shimmick. Lewis Pamel might be a familiar name. And Pamel and McBride worked together on getting our state parks established. And that's why there is a Pamel State Park and a McBride State Park. And of course, Lake McBride. Both of those being over in the Iowa City area. And then as we move into the 20th century, Ada Hayden, we've already talked about a little bit, and then there are some others. I will mention that while most of these researchers from the time of Charles Bessie onward were from either Iowa State or the University of Iowa. However, Henry Conard spent his career at Grinnell. And then he spent a number of years in his retirement at the University of Iowa. He had a strong interest in mosses, and he moved to Iowa City to work at the university on getting his moss collections updated and named and labeled appropriately. And of course, those collections now are here. So after 1950, it becomes more complicated with the growth of the programs at a number of colleges and universities, as well as the establishment of the Iowa Conservation Commission. Of course, now that's the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. But I also want to mention the work of Robert Thorne in the 1950s and the early 1960s, and note that he and his grad students did a number of studies of the flora of counties and regions of the state. But backing up to the beginning of the list, we saw the name of Edwin James. And yes, he's the same scientist that some of you might know was the first Euro-American to climb Pikes Peak in Colorado. But in this case, we see that he made note of and collected some plants from the southwestern corner of what would become Iowa in 1820 when he was on the Long expedition. So those, as far as we know, are the earliest documented plant lists and specimens that were collected in the state. And now we'll hop back to the present. And so you might be wondering, what references do we usually turn to for information about Iowa's plants? Well, one of Dr. Thorne's former grad students, Larry Eilers, became the taxonomist at the University of Northern Iowa. And he teamed up with Dean Rosa at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources in authoring The Vascular Plants of Iowa, a Checklist and Natural History. This 1994 reference has served as the baseline checklist of Iowa's vascular flora to date. Subsequently, the published volumes of Flora of North America have given us new insights into the taxonomic relationships of Iowa's taxa, and that's the species and other relationships between the plants, as well as alerting us to reports of species of which we were previously unaware, oftentimes from specimens that have been sent to other herbaria outside of the state that serve as the documenting specimens for the species occurrence in the state. To make our work and that of other Iowans easier, Nick Stoynoff, a citizen scientist and a resident of Illinois, has designed a website that provides comparisons of the species equivalents in the vascular plants of Iowa and in several of the published volumes of FNA. So to cross-reference between the two, Nick's website can come in handy. While the vascular plants of Iowa does indeed currently serve as our baseline for knowledge of Iowa's ferns, conifers, and flowering plants, much has been learned since its publication in 1994. And nearly every page of my copy of the checklist is as marked up as this one. I chose this page because I found that it had found it to be a surprise to learn when I first moved to Iowa that we have, or at least had, more than 30 species of orchids in the state. My primary role as curator of the Ada Hayden Herbarium is to take care of the specimens and make them available to those who have a reason to study them. But as Rich mentioned, my time also allows me to participate in projects with my colleagues. They include faculty from Iowa State and other colleges and universities, from the Department of Natural Resources, and with citizen scientists. And we have a number of projects underway. Those listed here involve information derived directly from the specimens of the herbarium. The project that may be the least familiar is to update the 1999 draft of coefficients of conservatism for each of Iowa's native plant species. Now, coefficients of conservatism involves assigning a number of 1 to 10 that is, in short, based on the concept that species with high coefficient values are highly intolerant to disturbance and are located in high quality natural sites. I'm also collaborating with other researchers, including Bill Norris and Jimmy Thompson, who are shown here, on several projects that we would like to bring to a close in the next few years. Jimmy, a citizen scientist who recently passed away, contributed information and specimens for the Story County project, which also involves Tom Rosberg at Drake University and Mark Wiederlechner, a retired horticulturist from the USDA North Central Region Plant Introduction Station here in Ames, as well as with Bill Norris. Bill is on the faculty at Western New Mexico University, and he got his PhD here at Iowa State. And so he has continued returning to Iowa for ongoing studies. And after completing studies of several preserves in Northeast Iowa, he and I are working on the flora of Mossy Glen State Preserve in Clayton County and Backbone State Park in Delaware County. Field work and other activities, like I've mentioned, that have led to published species lists have contributed to add to our knowledge of Iowa's flora and also specimens to the herbarium. However, for the most part, we have noted an interesting shift. For diverse and complicated reasons, there's no longer much activity by faculty at Iowa's 3 state universities to engage in field work and study of Iowa's flora. Instead, there's been a shift to floristic activities being done primarily by researchers at Iowa's smaller colleges and universities, by botanists at the Iowa DNR and other government and NGO staff, and by out-of-state researchers and citizen scientists. So what does the future hold? Well, fortunately, there are still graduate and undergraduate students who have had an interest in learning techniques used in collecting and studying Iowa's plants. A few of these have even completed a flora of a county park or some other such activity while working on a completely different project for their degree. I can also imagine even greater interaction with botanists at smaller universities, as together we improve our knowledge of the state's flora and track changes in our flora due to climate change and other impacts. If you have an interest in Iowa's native plants, but are wondering where to start for reference books, these might be some suggestions. And the following slide has the website information for the University of Iowa Press, where these and many more references can be found. But there are books on Iowa's wildflowers, on trees and shrubs. There's a number of the In Your Pocket series guides, which open out like a map. And I've got to be involved with one that is called Grasses in Your Pocket. And there are lots of others, both about plants and about animals like birds and reptiles and others. So these may be some references that can help you get started. And as you can see, my contact information at the is at the bottom of this page. So feel free to contact me if you can think of any questions, ideas, or comments later. But for now, maybe we can see what the question and answer box contains.
Okay, Deb, we have a question from Tucker Letter. What are the laws relating to plant collecting? I know it's illegal to remove them from certain public areas. Thanks.
Yes, for our state-owned lands and federal-owned lands, definitely a permit is needed. For local studies, it's good to talk with the County Conservation Board folks. They may or may not want you to have an official permit. However, they would probably enjoy knowing that there's someone out there interested in the plants within the county. And collecting along roadsides and, of course, with permission from private landowners, that can be done without a permit. But again, talking with the landowners is a great idea. We used to be able to collect even along railroad tracks, but for here in Story County, Union Pacific is our primary railroad going through the county, and they completely outlaw people from being on the railroad rights of way. So a great question. It kind of depends on where you would like to collect, and most people are happy to allow collecting, but talking to the folks who control the particular lands is probably a great idea. Good question. Thank you.
Okay, Deb, another question from Ruth Rose. Do you host classes on how to preserve specimens for amateurs for their own personal collections and documentation?
I've done a little of that. And of course, with COVID, we haven't been able to meet in person. I did do a presentation for the Des Moines Botanical Garden, and I would love to, well, I did that one virtually, but it's so much better if we could meet in person and do that. So maybe over the next few months or something, I can be reminded by somebody to offer an invitation to do that.
That sounds great. Perhaps we'll have you visit Woodbury County in person to do so.
That would be fun.
And Cheryl Miller asked if you could perhaps say something about Paha Ridges.
Paha Ridges, okay. Those are found mostly on the Iowan surface in sort of east central Iowa. And those have a layer of loess at their tops where plants will grow. I'm wondering whether Rich knows even more about pahas than I do.
Yeah, it's kind of a soil, kind of a quaternary geology thing,
Mhm.
but it also relates to botany and also somewhat to the other biota that are out there. They're elongate ridges that are remnants from a massive, it's the Iowa erosion surface. And so there was a period of time before the Wisconsin glaciation where there was massive erosion. And I guess we were building the area down around New Orleans for that. Naturally happened, nothing humans did. And it's elongate ridges that tend to be capped with the remnant loess. And you wind up with forest vegetation on top of those out in the middle of nowhere. And the best place to see them is in Grundy County, south of Black Hawk County, in that part of the state. So it's really an interesting feature in Iowa. Paha, the word actually means hill or small mountain in Lakota language.
So Rich is a kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to thinking about natural history type stuff. He mentioned being an agronomist, but he's also a really good soil scientist. Well, I guess that kind of falls under agronomy as well. But I probably would have emailed him if I had gotten that question, here locally and didn't have him on the presentation with me.
Now, Deb, I don't know if you mentioned that you're actually in the herbarium right now.
I am, yes.
And how large actually is the herbarium?
As far as space goes, we occupy 4 rooms. We have a smaller room where we process specimens that have just come in. We kind of call it the dirty plant room around here. It's got a table and the dryer, and that's where we store our plant presses and pressing supplies. And it's got a freezer. And so that room gets used as the first step in the process. And then we have a plant mounting space that has a sink and things like that, where the specimens actually get, after they've been through the freezer, get glued to the sheets of paper and sewn or strapped, as I think I briefly mentioned, and get them ready to go into the herbarium. And there are some cabinets in there for sorting the materials so that they can be most efficiently filed. And then the collection itself is in a very large room. I'm terrible at guessing, but it actually crosses the entire interior part of Bessie Hall in length. And each of our rows has 8 cabinets that are back to back with another 8 to form a row, so that we've got a lot of cabinets in this particular room where I'm speaking right now, and then a room about half that size, also with cabinets that are, on the compactor system and things too.
Great. And Aaron Baston, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name, would like to know if you need an appointment to visit the herbarium.
Hi, Aaron. And no. Well, yes. If you can email me or call me, I've got my address and phone number here. So it would be great to do that. And I do give tours of the herbarium to groups or even to individuals who are interested. So contact me and we'll set up a time for a tour of the herbarium.
And Rich would like to know, what is the oldest voucher that you know to be in the Ada Hayden Herbarium, to your knowledge?
Okay, well, I mentioned the one from 1785, and that's the oldest one that I have found so far. Of course, that one was not collected in Iowa. For Iowa collections, those would be specimens collected by Charles Christopher Perry, who was a medical doctor in Davenport. And he started making collections in the spring of 1847. So going back a good ways.
Okay, that's all the questions I see right now. Is there another one coming in? Oh, who and how are new specimens identified? Again, from Erin.
Okay. um, so we often work with the collector on ways to identify plants if they need that assistance. We have the reference books here. I get involved with that frequently for determining specimens. And yet we encourage the collector to kind of walk through the process and learn how to identify plants. And of course, some are rather easy. Some things are obvious, have obvious features, and are maybe represented in Iowa by only a few species. Others, like the genus Carex, which is in the sedge group, is terrible. There's like 126 species, and it's when I say microscopic, I mean under a dissecting microscope, not a standard light microscope. But you really, really have to look closely to be able to find the characters for telling those apart. And fortunately, we've got some researchers who have taken on the challenge of that group and are much more familiar with them than I am. And so a lot of times I turn to one of them for help.
Okay, I have a couple more from Diane Blankenship. Are there field trips that will help people get to know our plants? Are there leaders to help educate us in the field?
Well, certainly, as Diane well knows, the Les Hills Prairie Seminar and other similar kinds of gatherings, that one's definitely at or near the top of my list for learning the Les Hills plants, where folks can come out and spend a weekend with experts on a lot of topics, not just plants, but become introduced also to birds or reptiles or soils or just all sorts of things. When Dr. Tiffany was still living, she did the fungi and mushrooms and all of that, group. And so there are some other opportunities for that. The Native Plant Society and the Iowa Prairie Network and others lead afternoon field trips or morning field trips, things like that, out with experts in the state. And we've got some actually coming up, I know, for the Iowa Native Plant Society. And so I encourage you to check out the Iowa Native Plant Society if you aren't familiar with it. And our information, including our most recent newsletter, is posted online, and you can find out more about those opportunities. And the same is also true for the Iowa Prairie Network.
Thank you. Yes, and Julianne Fisher would like to know, are the species collections stored in fireproof cabinets so that they are protected from fire?
Well, they are in metal cabinets. So they would have a little bit of protection from fire. We also, unfortunately, in my opinion, had to have a sprinkler system installed. So I'm actually more worried about water than I am about fire at this point. And there have been a number of herbaria that burned, including a very large herbarium in Berlin during World War II that was bombed and burned, and a lot of very important specimens, including the type specimens, were lost at that time. But here at Iowa State, as I said, I'm because of the sprinkler system, I'm more worried about water and hoping that we don't have leaks than I am about fire, because I think that the fires would be suppressed by the sprinkler system.
Okay, and I believe we'll get time for one more from Sarah Price. Are there specific plants here in Iowa being studied for medical development that you're aware of?
Oh, that's an area where that I haven't gotten into very much. I'm sure that there probably are some, but as I say, that's outside of my expertise. I don't know if Rich, as a panelist, might be aware of any.
The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is cannabis.
Yes.
And I know there have been some studies before wild type cannabis versus the cultivated types. And I know that I think Dr. Pohl did a bunch of stuff with that.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And of course, that was years ago, though, so that one didn't pop into my head. But today, with the CBD and stuff like that able to be sold and all, I'm sure that people will be looking more closely for different genetic strains of cannabis.
Okay, and I had Rich had mentioned or asked, how do you correct misidentified or changed voucher specimens?
Aha. Well, we attach a small label to them that we call an annotation label, and it includes the corrected name as well as the name of the person who made that determination and the date of that correction. And the date can be kind of important because sometimes specimens get quite a few labels on them, sometimes changing back and forth between the original name and the new name and the original name and the new name or whatever. And we track that, of course, by the date. And so that's how we are able to do that without actually writing directly on the specimen itself, but instead gluing a label to it. And so.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us today. And thanks to the Lost Hills Wild Ones and Woodbury County Conservation Foundation for co-sponsoring. And Deb, it's been great seeing you on Zoom, and we'll look forward to seeing you in person soon. Okay. Take care all and get out and enjoy this beautiful day.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.